Okay, so I'm the faculty advisor for University of Nebraska chapter, and a couple of years ago I took some of the Village Earth courses. I don't know if any of you have ever taken some of them online. It's just basically discussion, but it's really finding out some more resources, and that's where this came out of, was some of the readings that I did for that class, and then we implemented them in our projects. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go through what the most significant change is, and then we'll talk about how we're using it, and then I'll give a little brief idea about, I was going to show a video, but it's not working on this computer, so I'll talk about instead about some of the ideas that another way to use most significant change. Okay, so what is it? So first off, you're really just asking people to tell stories, but you ask them to tell you specific stories. And you collect, the basic idea is you collect a whole bunch of these stories, and then they kind of sift up, and you figure out in a variety of different ways that you can do this, what one that you believe or the community believes is the most significant story. So this was developed by Rick Davies in 1995. He used this in participatory rural development program in Bangladesh. There's the reference for it. You can actually download this, and it's freely distributable as long as you're not asking for any money for it. So when we did a similar presentation a year ago at the Midwest Regional Conference, we actually brought about 50 copies of it. I didn't want to fly with 50 copies. It's different driving, so. But it's easily downloadable, and it's a pretty easy read through it. So if you just search on most significant change and Davies and Dart, you'll find it. So one of the reasons why we picked it is our projects, we were starting implementation of solar energy projects to provide lights in schools, and we knew that we weren't going to be able to capture some of those evaluations. We wouldn't be able to monitor or figure out what's going on because we just had all qualitative metrics, and they looked like they were going to take a while. So we needed some qualitative stuff, or just trying to figure out how we could get a sense of what's going on with the project. And most significant change has worked well for us, and we've had it identify unexpected changes. I'm not sure if we've figured out that it's clearly identified the values of a community or organization, but we're getting the sense that we're getting a slightly different information from the stories we're collecting versus what we're being told in a formal setting. The best thing about it is it doesn't require many special skills. In fact, no special professional skills, just the ability to ask an open-ended question and listen and write down notes or record it by video. We're certainly finding a lot richer information, just like it says it's supposed to, and it's really a bottom-up method because you're asking the community and a wide variety of people in the community. So it's bottom-up, which is also nice. So when to use it, I said that we're using it because we're really trying to figure out what's going on. So we're really trying to learn rather than just do check marks of how many schools we've put lights into, how many students are in those classrooms, those basic metrics like that, which is accountability. We're really understanding what the impact is to the community. So you're learning here. Conventional monitoring systems may be a struggle, especially if they're taking a longer time to actually be able to measure things. This is something that you can do that's quick and easy, and you get a sense of what's going on right away. So there's 10 steps. I'm going to go through each one of these. So it's just a quick overview. Getting started, establishing domains of change. We'll talk about that, what that means. Defining the reporting period, collecting the stories, reviewing the stories. Then providing some feedback, because it's good to tell the community that, yes, we've listened to your stories and we've listened to you. You also have to make sure that you're hearing correct stories or true stories, so you have to verify them. Then you can actually Even though this is qualitative, you can do some quantitative stuff with it. And then the last, you look at this. So we've done these initial survey, initial analysis, and then you do a secondary analysis where you're kind of getting a sense of the whole. And then the last one is revising the process that you're using, and repeating the whole thing goes in a circle. Okay, so one thing you have to do is you have to explain it. So one way to explain most significant change is, it's kind of like the daily newspaper. There's a bunch of stories in there. The one that the editor thinks is the most important gets, top center of the page. And the other stories, they're important as well, but they're in different places. You can organize the stories by different sections: sports, news, business, living, that kind of stuff. So, you can use metaphors to explain it. You can also talk about, what are different events that happen during the year. It's kind of like, tell me about your different events that happen and which holiday is the most important and why. Also can give you a perspective that, all these little collective stories come up and tell you what's going on. So I like the Nemo fish, all the little school imitating Nemo, but it gets across exactly what Nemo is grumpy about. Or you can think of it's kind of like a restaurant menu. Here's all these different things you can choose from, and then you pick which one is the most important to you, which one you want to focus in on for dinner. So one thing we realized right off the bat is starting small is a very good thing, and we were really pleased that we started this with just one school instead of trying to do it. We've got actually 9 different schools that we're working with in our community, and so being able to start with one school was a good thing. So start small. Establishing domains of change. Basically, it's, think of this again like the newspaper. You're dividing up the stories into different categories. You don't necessarily have to do this. If there's not that many stories, it might just be all in one category. Okay, so generally domains are broad and fuzzy, where you think you expect that you might see change. You can definitely change these categories as you go along. If you're finding that there's no stories in a particular category, but there's a ton in a category that you didn't think was going to have some, and you might need to split that out into several categories. You can, they help you sort the stories, but they're not necessary. You don't necessarily have to sort the stories to begin with. It's really important to not overlook negative changes. Any change is what you're looking for, both positive and negative. You also don't want to have so many categories that there's just like one story in each category. So key thing here is let the stories tell you the domain, which is essentially letting the community tell you what the domains are. You can actually, instead of predetermining what the domains are, what the areas are for the stories, you can hear them and then let the community tell you what categories they think they ought to be organized in. Okay, so with the most significant change, there's a reporting time frame. And you have to define that so that people know when you ask them, tell me about change, you have to give them a time period, because they might talk about change that happened, long time ago that was, had nothing to do or would have had nothing to do with your project. So you have to think about, you can do a low frequency and annual, which is what we use. Every time we go on a trip, and we generally travel just once a year. You can do a higher frequency. If you've got a good NGO that is really helping you, they might be somebody to collect the stories for you throughout the year. There's a reason to have a higher frequency to begin with, because there might be a whole backload of stories that the community wants to get across to you. When you first come into a community, they might want to tell you everything. After you've done a project, it might generate even more stories. So to begin with, you can have a lot of stories, just a backload. So maybe more frequency, or just understanding you're going to have could have a potential big flood of stories to begin with, is something to think about. Okay, so a problem with saying collecting a story is story can have different meanings, especially if it's being translated. You want to make sure you're getting across what you mean by a story. When we talk about a newspaper story, we expect that to be factual. But if you're talking about a fairy tale story, we know that's not necessarily factual, so you need to make sure what you mean by it. So sometimes, instead of saying, tell me a story, you don't use the word story. Just tell me about what has happened. Can you give me testimony? Although testimony can have different connotations too. So you have to be careful with your word choice here, especially if you're going through a translator. Spend time talking with the translator up front so that you and the translator are going to get across what you mean by story. So a big thing is to ask a very open-ended question. You don't want to ask specific things. You actually want to ask a very open-ended question. So here's a good one. So looking back over the past year, so that defines the period of time that you're asking them to think about. What do you think? You're saying, we want to hear this from you. If this is not coming from us, this is coming from you. What was the most significant change? So you want, there might have been a lot of changes in the community over the last year, but you want them to tell you what they think the most significant one was for them over this last year. And then what type of change are you looking for? We're looking for, in this question, the quality of people's lives. And then where? So you define it by time, you define it by place, you define it that it's theirs, you're defining what you want. You're talking about, I want to hear about change, and I want to hear about change in quality of people's lives. Okay, so all of these, coming up with a question is not necessarily the easiest, but it needs to be open-ended, and it needs to focus in on what you're trying to understand more about. So there's a lot of different ways to capture stories. You can write down unsolicited stories you've heard, which means you have to really be listening to the community, and anything you hear, write it down. Hey, I heard that this was going on or that was going on. Even if you don't think it relates to your project, it's a good thing to capture just all these little stories. You can do a more formal one, interview and note-taking. You can have a group discussion. So the interview and note-taking, that could be with individual people, or it could be through a group. You could ask the beneficiaries to write the story directly. That creates a problem that not everybody can read and write. So this is where video, the little video clip I was going to show at the end, basically is going through, use video, because everybody can listen to somebody else. Watching the stories is actually a good way to handle it. Okay, so what to capture? Basic information, who collected the story, when the events occurred, the story itself, what happened, and then the significance. Why is it significant to the storyteller? You can ask, why is this significant to you? Why is this particular story you're telling me is important? What different, you can do some follow-up questions to try to get the significance. The last one, what recommendations do you have, is a good way to get them to say how they'd like to continue to see change happen, or whether it was good or bad. So whose stories to collect? Certainly the people who you think are benefiting from the project, you want to collect stories from them. You could do it as a group or individuals again. Another good source that we had found, and also is part of the document that Davies and Dart have, is field workers such as Peace Corps volunteers. So we've actually heard stories from the Peace Corps volunteers in our community that our community did not tell us. And it comes to the difference in just how the society is and how people tell our community. They don't ever want to tell us that we've done something wrong. So they're always praising us and always saying anything we've done is good. But the Peace Corps volunteers being there, they'll hear stories about maybe there's something that we were doing that wasn't as good. So it's good to have that type of person that you can, or your NGO can serve that as well. Okay, there's ethics involved in this. You can't just go and take things from the community. So you want to get consent. You want to ask people to consent to give the story. Invite them to come. Tell them they don't have to, and it's up to them whether they want to be part of this. Get permission to use their names. Allow them to remain anonymous if they want to. Some people want to have their name, are fine with it. Some people don't want to, especially if it's a negative story. They may not want their name associated with it. And they may not want to say a negative thing in a group setting as well. It's important to explain to them how you're using the story. So we spent time to explain to our community. We have all these numbers that we write down, but we're not going to see those numbers for quite a while. But we want to hear from them. We don't know how, one of our metrics is we want it to increase retention of students in school by having lights in schools. But we can't tell that for several years. So that's something we're not going to be able to see. So it's important for us to hear from them. What do they see happening? So once you've got all these stories, got a bunch of different stories down the bottom, you might have different groups or different people go through and decide, they read through or listen to all the stories again, and they pick out of that group which one did they think as a group was the most significant. And then you might have another level. So this could be if you're asking from, in our community, for example, it's a community of about 10,000, but there's about 12 different smaller communities in that. So it could be each village has a selection, and then it goes up to the county level where the mayor and the county representatives will then select which one they think is the most important for the overall area. So this is where trying to select stories. First, everybody has to read or listen to the stories. This is where video can be really important, is you can show a video of the stories that's been put together in a compilation. And instead of having to have a storyteller each time, somebody reading it or somebody retelling the stories, you can just have the video. Generally, the idea is to have an in-depth conversation with the group that's picking the stories and have them discuss why they think one is more significant than the other and get a group consensus. And then you want to document, this last one is actually important, you want to document why the group is picking that. It helps it helps understand just this reason of why they pick it helps you better understand what's important to that community that you might not have heard otherwise. So there's lots of different ways you can work with a community to act the criteria. Majority rules is one. You can have iterative voting. You could have, okay, let's vote this way, and which one do you think is the most significant in this domain? Which one do you think is the most significant in that domain? You can tally up those scores. You can do ratings. You don't have to, give it a rating from 1 to 10. You could have somebody go through and pre-score and say, we think this is a good one. We think this. But again, you can do secret ballot, and this is something that the community can help you decide on as well. How do they want to pick? You could use their process as well. Okay, so you want to document the process and all the results from that process. A really important thing here is don't ever discard a story. Every story was told to you because that storyteller thought it was significant. So you don't want to discount anybody's version of what they think is significant. So feedback's important, so they know it wasn't just you listening to them and then nothing happened to it. We certainly have heard this in our community. When we have asked questions, they're like, well, somebody was here just asked me this last year. Why didn't you talk to them? Or like, we didn't know about it, and they don't know the context. So it's been important for our community for us to go back and say, here's what you told us last year. Now tell us again, is it something changed? Is it something different? And they like the fact that we come back and say, here's what we heard last year, and here's the stories we heard last year, and here's what we thought was significant. And tell us, let's talk about this again. Are there any new stories, any new changes that might have happened? Okay, verifying it. So you want to make sure they're not telling you on purpose something significant just for some reason that they've got. So you want to make sure somebody hasn't lied about something. You also want to make sure you correctly understand what's gone on, and especially with translation, you've got a problem there with, you want to make sure you actually understood how it was being translated and that you've got the right translation. You also want to make sure the significance is properly stated, that they're not saying it's overly stated or underly stated. You want to get that correct level of significance. So who verifies it? You actually want to go and maybe talk to somebody else in that same community and say, did you see this? And yes, I've seen it. It's actually been. So sometimes you can call this verification. Another way to talk about it, instead of, when you say verification, that kind of implies that you think somebody was lying to you. So another way to go and verify this is not to say that you're verifying it, but you just want to follow up. Because we're not saying that somebody's lied. We just want to make sure that that we're understanding this correctly. Okay, so most significant change, it really emphasizes qualitative reporting, but you can quantify it in 3 ways. Within the story, how many people are involved, how many activities. You can start counting things, what happened in the story and how many times did you hear that. Within a domain, you can hit how many times did we hear the same story about this same issue. If they're talking about there's land purchase, well, you can start adding up all that different land that was purchased and what's the aggregate total that you heard was purchased. That also helps you, by quantifying it that way, helps you understand, are you getting good information, or is it overestimated, underestimated? If they're telling you more land was purchased than the land in the community, maybe there's a scaling factor there. It's not that they're trying to lie, but maybe everybody just automatically scales up or automatically scales down. So doing this type of quantification can give you an estimate. Are these even reasonable estimates? So one of the things that we found is within all stories, we hear about the same change maybe over and over again. So maybe that gives it a bigger weight that, hey, lots of people are telling us the same story, where we only heard about one change from one person. That's another way to follow up and verify. You can go back and you can say, we only heard this from one person. Does anybody else think that that's important or not? And you don't have to tell who it was, but okay, so conducting a second one. Again, this is, lots of piles of stories here. Put it in different piles, sort them, try to figure out, are there some common themes going on here? How can you group them? They've got arrows shown here. Is there a relationship between the different types of domains? So one thing you can do here is you can actually start tagging them. Is how I kind of think of this, as a way to set up a bunch of metadata for each story. An ID number, title, date it was recorded, who documented it, who told it, details about them, the selection process, any subsequent selection process, follow-up actions or recommendations, and then what actions were actually taken. So I kind of look at this as the metadata for all the stories. And if you have the metadata, you can put it into a database and you can start doing sorting on it and seeing how these categories or the domains, you can have, sometimes the metadata will help you sort it into domains. Okay, so when you revise it, one of the first things you ask are, do we have the right domains? are we actually, if we go every month and we're not hearing any stories, maybe we're doing it too frequently. If we do it once a year and that's all we do is listen to stories for day after day after day, we probably need to do it a little bit more frequently. You might see in doing the quantification that you're only hearing from a certain economic strata. You're not getting all the economic levels in the community. You're only hearing from, you're not hearing from you've got a low representation of women to men, which is a common thing. So you can start looking at your metadata and seeing, am I getting a good sample? Which means, do you need to have the selection process change? Do you need to figure out a way to get to those groups, maybe the poorest of the poor in the community? You're not hearing from them. Okay, so with that, that's kind of an overview of most significant change. I really would highly recommend going and looking at the Davies and Dart document, because it's a great reference. So what I want to go through here is how we've used it, kind of our plan for monitoring, our challenges, how we're evaluating our program, how we've used most significant change, and our plans for the future. So we work in Madagascar. Everybody always wants to know, how do you get there? Whoops. So long flights and then a 12-hour drive after 24 hours of flying. So it's a long ways. This is our community. It's taken from the mayor's office. And it looks like I've got an automatic timing in here, so I'll have to stop it. So I said we've got a community of 10,000, and it's stretched out along the road about 22 kilometers. They call them fukuntanis instead of villages, is, I guess, the easiest way. The county seat and the county are the same name, so that's even more confusing to people. Basically, each one of those points is a major village that's got a school in it. So this is a typical school. Very dark, so that's one of the reasons why the community wanted solar power. So here we are measuring on our first technical assessment trip, measuring for actual solar installation. We've got the panels ready and getting ready to put them up as an assembly on the roof. Then we're going through and doing training with the head of the schools and a teacher and our translator. Although the teacher, you can't see, they're out of the picture. Then finally we have lights in a school. It's my favorite picture. It's right before we had a community. We also have a biosand filter project. We're in the monitoring phase on that. And we're just in the assessment phase for a gravity flow tap system rehabilitation. And these are all projects in the same program in the same community. So it makes our lives easier. We can have 2 teams over as one travel team to go do this stuff. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about our power supply project primarily, because this is the project that we were trying to figure out, how do we actually get some type of measure. Our quantitative metrics that we defined were the availability of sunlight. Are we actually capturing the sunlight that we think we can? Is it functioning properly? Then our qualitative metric was impact on the community, which broke down into increased attendance at school, increased passing of national exams. They're on the French education system, so at the end of 5th grade, they all have to pass an exam to go on to middle school. If they don't pass that exam, that's the end of their schooling. So we're doing that type of, but it could be several years before we see a change in attendance rates, or change in graduation rates, or change in being able to go on to middle school. So the community was talking about using lights at the schools, be able to help with adult literacy and improve adult literacy. So how do we capture that? So this is where likely to take years to see these impacts on the community. The other problem is it's a phased construction. We've got 9 schools and it'll be 2017 before we finish. So we do a couple schools each year. That allows the community to raise their 5%, allows us to raise enough money to do this each year. Some years we'll do 2, some years we'll do 1, just depends on the complexity of the school. And we want to have, as we go through this phase process, it allows us to figure out, essentially make improvements every time to the system and be able to go back and correct systems as well to try to make a better product for the community. So this is the first school we installed lights at. And we set up a discussion with teachers, parents, and pupils in the school. They thought it was a little weird to have set up in a circle to discuss, because that's not how this teacher or this school does things. It's all very rigid, so that was a new thing. But I think it worked well. So our question was, we asked them, looking back over the last year, what has changed from before with no lights in the classroom to now with lights in the classroom? So we just tried to be as, here's the one thing that changed that we implemented was lights in the classroom, and tell us what happened. And we asked this to teachers, students, and parents. Now, we've certainly seen asking this to all of them in one room. The students are a little shy, and also since it's a group setting, they're giving us all positive answers in the group setting. So some of the changes we heard from these were the teachers use lights to prepare lessons for the next day. So they don't have to go home with a candle and try to prepare lessons or come in early. So it's not, they like the flexibility of being able to prepare lessons at night. The students like having group study sessions for their national exam. So the 4th and 5th graders like being able to get together and do this and be able to ask each other and have kind of a built-in support group instead of individually trying to study by themselves at night at home. They say they can spend more time with their studies year-round. And another thing was that we hadn't really thought we would see, but parents don't have to spend extra money on candles for students to study at home. So the parents like, hey, I didn't have to buy more candles so that my kid could study to get into 6th grade. They can just walk over to the school in the evening and study there. So it has an economic benefit that we hadn't really expected to hear. We thought it might be, but we hadn't expected to hear that. So that was the first year we did it. This last year we installed, this last year we went to the 2 schools we installed at the year before. So another year, another school, but we're hearing the same story. Students can spend more time on their studies year-round. Parents don't have to spend extra money on candles. We heard that story again at a different school. And the 2 schools, they're pretty far apart. One is clear at the end, and the other was about in the middle, so they're probably about 10 kilometers along the road apart. And some of these, the only time they're going to be in the other community is maybe market day. And this community that's clear on the edge, there are people in that community that have never gone down to the county seat. They've never traveled that 10 kilometers down the road. So this story might be, we have an idea that this might be kind of independent. It's possible that it's independent of the other school, that they weren't actually talking to each other. And then they were all really proud at one school that all the students studying for their national exams that year, they had actually all passed it. Now, whether that's just because they're great students that year, which can happen, or whether it's because they had a support group or they had extra time to study, we don't know. But we did hear that story. So they were proud that, they hadn't had that before, so they found that as a significant change, that everybody finally passed everybody who was studying in the study group passed the exam. And then this teacher over here on the right, she wanted that little girl to put that on because she was so proud. She was like, I want them to understand how important these lights are to making a better life. So, it was a cute picture. Okay, so those are the stories we heard that were positive and they were happy, and they've got this cute little girl making us feel good about what we're doing. But that was all the positive stories. We didn't hear, we even asked, we want to hear if there's a problem or something's wrong or you don't like something about this, we want to hear that. They would not tell us, they said, oh no, everything's perfect in the group setting. But it's not, so we actually heard negative things, and this was just being more attuned to listening in the community. So one thing we heard was, when teachers retire, they don't always transfer that knowledge about how the system works, how to replace light bulbs. They don't transfer that knowledge. So that's a negative. So we got to figure out how to get that knowledge transfer. They didn't tell us in either group, even though we saw there were light bulbs burned out, and asked, what's going on with it. They said, oh, they just burned out. But when we got the teacher alone, without the parents, without the students, then the teacher said, I don't know where to find these. I thought we could find them in this one town, but we can't find them. Can you help me? So this teacher didn't want to say in front of the group that he didn't know how to solve this problem. But he would tell it to us, but he didn't tell it to the larger group. They didn't want to tell us that theft and vandalism are problems at schools that are not right adjacent to by houses. We had to put stuff into a school and have it, while we were actually there doing an installation, they broke in and tried to steal the batteries. We hadn't installed the batteries yet, but that's clearly what they were looking for. And then they said, oh yeah, this school is going to get broken into because there's not a house right next to it. So that was something that was significant to us that we'd not heard until we actually had a problem. And they were not surprised about it, but they were surprised we didn't know. So that's a story that we had to listen, we heard about in a very different way. I talked about our biosand filter project. They'd all been, oh, this is great. They formed a biosand filter association. But then we heard, as we went around to these schools doing the solar project, the teachers would come to us and say, oh, by the way, your biosand filter project that you helped us set up the association for, that association is not working anymore. And then some of them would say, well, it's just malcontent. So we started started listening to that. And it's the local politics. They're having a mayoral election this year. And three head teachers are running for mayor. And they were all on the Biosand Filter Association committee. So it's politics that have gotten in the way. But that's something for us to understand. And then on the TAP system, just doing some really basic assessment stuff, because it really wasn't an assessment for the water system, but the community wanted us to do some more with the water system even though it was a solar trip. We said, well, we know our water group has said that they probably need to do some maintenance. So we went up to the intake system and did a little, just looked at it, did a little bit of maintenance, really just about 10 minutes worth of maintenance. So not all the maintenance that needs to be done. But we heard from the Peace Corps volunteer the next day that all of a sudden people were really happy about what we had done because the taps that hadn't been flowing were now flowing. So that's a story that has both positive and negative. It's great that it worked, but it's also negative that they thought we did it, even though we didn't really, other than helping them haul rocks a little bit further away from the intake system. It was the community that was digging it out. It wasn't us. So we've got to have them more empowerment and more motivation and understanding that they're the ones that did it. It wasn't us. So that one has a positive and negative. But it's all these stories that you just have to listen to and be more attuned for, that these stories can, even though they weren't told directly by a community member, they're stories that we're hearing about the community. And we haven't brought these because of the political issues and all the people running for mayor. There was like a dozen people running for mayor, and 3 of them are head teachers of different schools. And another one was the superintendent of school. So teachers are heavily involved, and we decided instead of this year going through and having the community go through the discussion of which one they thought was most significant, we would just wait and have 2 years worth of stories to have them go through next year after they get through elections and things settle down a little bit. At least we hope they settle down. So going forward, we actually think video is a pretty good way to do it because there are quite a few people in the community that are not literate, but they have they're major figures in the community, well-respected elders who are not able to read. So if we want them to participate in selecting which story is the most significant, we need to have a way that they can actually participate. So videotaping these is really important, which means we probably need to do a good job of it. And that's what the video clip I wanted to show was. It was having the community members actually go and ask this question about what's the most significant change instead of us asking it. So that's probably a pretty good thing. I don't know if we're going to be able to do that just because we're not there all the time. And the video clip talked about spending 6 months training people on how to use the video equipment, how to ask the questions, and then another 6 months to actually go and collect stuff. Or it was a year, maybe it was 9 months training and 3 months, I can't remember. But we have found it interesting to hear what the different schools are telling us. Some schools have much more active teachers and much more engaged teachers than others, so we get different stories from those schools. We want to continue to have the community help us determine which are the most significant stories. The first year they really thought the most significant story was that all the students who had studied at school at night for their exams passed their exams. That was what they were most proud of and thought was the most significant. We need to continue to have these discussions to see if that continues to be it, or is it that we've heard 2 stories where parents were saving money by not having to buy as many candles. We've also found it's a great way to listen to the community and do a better job of listening to the community. It slows engineers down. Instead of, well, what's the number and how do I measure this? You have to step back and you really have to slow down and just sit there and listen. And as I said, we've been using this just for our solar project, our power project, but certainly our water projects have benefited from this because we've heard stories about them that we would not have heard any other way. So you hear stories that are unexpected. Okay, with that, I'll open it up to questions. I think we got about 15 minutes left, right? Yes?
So what are you doing with the story after that? You collected the most,
Well,
the
it's
best story is, and then what?
it's a way for us to monitor the project. So in our PMEL, we can actually include that as, here's what we saw when we were monitoring the project. We heard from the community that.
So when you're reporting it, you're talking about not just that one that you think was the best.
Right.
Or your most significant change. You're using a collective way as
Right.
the trends we saw.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
What's
So
the point of picking the best one? You need to. I mean, unless maybe you were trying to.
I think you're trying to, from what how we're using it, is helping us understand what the community finds most valuable to our project. And helps us understand better how the community is relating to the project, I think is what we're finding out from this. Honestly, we didn't know how we were going to use this to begin with.
No, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's, and plus at the end, it's a way to, with the metadata that we get, it's a way to start trying to think about how well this project worked and what changes did we make and how did we respond to the changes that they were saying, both positive and negative. How did we respond to them? How did we do that? Yeah.
Language seems like it would be a huge barrier to this. Do you have someone translate it on the spot, or do you have someone watch the videos after and tell you what they said? Because I know that in my experience, we'll into that, and how do you overcome that?
We spend time talking with our translator before we go and ask the questions and explaining to our translator how this process works. So we kind of go through this in a shorter aspect, but we go through what's the purposes, why are we doing this, what do we expect. We go through and we work with our translator to make sure that we're translating, that she's getting the right translation for the question we're asking. We've talked about the use of the word story, and she said that's fine, they understand what we're asking for is truthful, not fictional, not fairy tale stuff. We then, afterwards, we'll have her go back and either while we're there or we'll leave the video, a copy of the videos with her, and she'll go back through and translate and do a transcript. And we've asked her, I've told her, since I'm the one who pays her as the faculty advisor, we've told her if she wants to have somebody else help her, and to make sure that she's getting the right translation, to hire a secondary translator. So we actually have, I think, 3 translators that work with us that we pay kind of an annual stipend to keep them continue to work. And one I've never seen, who just does kind of the verification with the other 2 translators that have traveled with us. So yeah, because there's like 22 different dialects of Malagasy in Madagascar, and then French is their next language, and then a few people speak some English. But so it's, our translators are from the capital city, which is a different dialect than the community we're in, so they have to understand the dialect. So we've got all sorts of different issues. So that's why the translation stuff is a really difficult part, and something we probably spend more money on translation than what we thought we were going to, just because of that. Yes?
How does the community feel about having to choose one story over other stories?
I'm not sure exactly how they feel about that. They seem to be able to do it. I think one of the things that's helped us is the point I made about, don't ever discard a story because they were significant to some person. We actually let them know that we're going to retain all these because we find all the stories useful to us, but we want them to tell us which one they think for the community is the most significant.
So I guess my other question is, if you're using video a lot, I guess nobody requests anonymity.
We haven't used video so much to begin with. We did a little bit more this last year before I actually had seen that clip, because we were just trying to capture what we were doing better and we've asked them, are you fine with us videotaping it and taking pictures? And they've said yes. So I don't know, it's a tough thing to try to figure out, but clearly in the group setting we don't hear the negative stories. So when the video camera or camera itself is not out, we hear different stories. So I think there's something to that they don't, and that's certainly the case in, they don't want any one person to lose face, including us. So privately they'll say something, but not publicly. So I'm sure that's one of the reasons why we don't always hear the negative stories in a group setting. And that's been a learning process for us as well. The first year we did this, we're like, wow, they're so happy. And then the second year we started hearing all these, maybe it's not perfect stories just by carefully listening. And so I think there's something to that. Yes?
How much time out of your trips does this take? This seems like a pretty involved process.
It's not that involved. We set up a meeting at each school. Right now we just have 4 schools. Of course it grows all the time. And it might be that we don't ask each school the same, we don't go back to the same school year after year after year. We might skip some years, or we might do a less formal, but we generally set up an evening meeting with each school. So during the day we're doing implementation or assessment stuff, and then in the evening we'll go and have a meeting at the schools where we now have light to have these meetings. And that's when the community wants to have these meetings as well, because during the day they're busy with subsistence farming and business and stuff like that. So that teachers the parents especially can't meet during the day. So you can fit it in. It just means you've got some evenings where you can't sit down and do other stuff that you'd like to do. You just got to know, okay, tonight's a community meeting. Yeah.
On a side note, I know this is a little off topic, but for such a large project and so many, what type of fundraising techniques do you guys do? Because you are paying your translators and you have to buy all supplies.
Yeah, so we sell pizza every Thursday. Posters around that say every Thursday is Pizza Thursday, and that generates about $4,000 over the year, which basically pays for one school, all the equipment, the solar equipment, all the lights, etc. We buy pizza from the vendor that sells pizza at the football games. They just package it the same way they sell it at football games, so it's in a package. We don't have to have any food handling stuff. It's actually really easy. So it's a handy setup that we have in Nebraska. We also have done some corporate fundraising. We've done a couple different things, and we've kind of settled on a health wellness run walk, where all the engineering firms in Omaha, which we're fortunate, we have a lot of engineering firms and some very big ones. We work with their wellness teams and kind of have a competition between the different firms on how many percentage-wise of people participate, and then they do corporate donations as part of that. So in general, that's been enough to do this, but we're only, the pizza sales cover most of the equipment. Translator, to be perfectly honest, it's embarrassingly cheap about how little we pay the translators over in Madagascar. I think I pay them $100 a year, and they think that that's great money. So these are people with a college education and supplemental income to them that they think is a really good income. And I've asked them, you tell me what I pay. So it's like 1/100 of a cent or less per word to have translated in a written document, and which is just, it's embarrassingly low how much we pay them. So, yeah. You had a question?
Well, I was just curious, because of the fact that they're reluctant to provide, as you say, negative feedback and maybe constructive feedback, I was just curious, what would your thinking be if that became the most significant thing, and they don't really want to sort of, they're not proud to expose that publicly. How might you sort of feel?
Well, this is where it's been interesting working with our translators when something's gone wrong, usually when I've done something wrong, that's usually what they will point out. Not when the students have done something wrong, but when I've done something wrong. It'll be somebody comes to our translator and will explain the problem. Then our translator will come to me and have this subtle hint that maybe something wasn't 100%, but everything's great. It'll be finished up with that. And I'll have to do some more asking, and I'll say, why do I need to talk with this person? And what do they want to tell me? And then will come out. So so I've learned that when they're going through this kind of back, this person you need to talk to this person who's going to tell you to talk to that person who's going to tell you to talk to this third, finally the person who I really need to talk to. There's a problem there, and I just need to listen to what everybody's telling me along the way. And I explain this to the students when we travel, that they need to be attuned to that as well. That when somebody says, you need to tell Dr. Jones to go talk to somebody, there's a problem there. Because if things are going well, they'll come and talk to me directly, or they'll talk to the students directly. But when they start telling you need to go talk to somebody, that's a clue that there's something negative. They will tell you this, but it's just in this very roundabout way, very indirect way, which first year I was just really frustrated. I was like, just tell me what's wrong. I'm not going to get upset. But it's really about, they don't want any one person to lose face, including me. They don't want me to lose face. So they will not say this directly to me in front of a group of people. And they'll go through several people to make sure that I know that it's, the more people it's gone through, the worse the problem is. I guess it's kind of, distancing it, and then I can come back. So, yeah. It's just, again, it's listening to the community and having to go through this and just sit there and listen to them talk and try not to ask follow-up questions. That's another thing. We just try to keep repeating that same question. But then we'll go into follow-up about why was that significant. Tell us what you're thinking. Why is this significant? Not, okay, now we want to hear about another part of it, or we want to hear about this, or we try to keep very focused in on that particular topic. Yes?
So EWB has endorsed this process?
I don't know if EWB has endorsed it. They asked me to come present about it. So it could, I said to begin with, I took a couple of online courses from Village Earth. And if you don't know about Village Earth, I can't remember, it's about $300 to do one of their online courses. But that's where I found this, and it was one of the resources that you've got 5 weeks and you get reading that could last you a year. And this is one of the resources, and I thought, this makes sense. We're trying to figure this out, and we wrote it up as our plans for going over as part of an implementation and then assessing what we had done the year before. We wrote this up so, project manager had seen this, and then when we came back, it worked well, and we presented on it at the regional conference, and so it fits in well with what they're doing. And I think one of the reasons, it's in the little write-up about it, if you've got the online version, not the paper version, talks about this is monitoring. It's a technique for monitoring because you can do it all the way through the process. And it's a technique for evaluation because you can compile all these stories and start looking at, trends and what are you hearing, that type of stuff. You can do that for evaluation at the end. And that's where I learned this from, was an online class on monitoring and evaluation. So, yeah. But it does fit in well with the PMEL process, especially for qualitative stuff. Yeah.
Have you ever had issues with apathy with other people in the process talking about their stories?
Apathy? I think we saw a little bit of apathy the second time we went to when we went to the first year. They were very enthusiastic. The second year, not quite so enthusiastic. So we'll see what happens this third year. We'll see if, there's this, they're here to talk about this same thing again. And it may be that after that, we may skip schools every other year, do that, if we've talked to them before. So we saw just a little, not quite as enthusiastic the second time. Still enthusiastic, but not quite as enthusiastic as they were the first year. Yes?
How would you pair this with a more, not that this isn't technical, but like technically easier to quantify project, say like a distribution project? Would you consider like a success in the community but a technical failure, or vice versa, something that didn't match? How would you kind of like combine that and use that together in a monitoring situation?
Well, most of our metrics are quantitative. Is the system performing properly? How many hours are they using it? How many students are in the classrooms? Things we can put a number on. So we can have the system functioning well, but maybe they're telling us stories that, okay, now, I actually thought I'd hear stories about, okay, now I've got a whole bunch of extra bugs flying around me and getting more mosquito bites because they're being attracted to this lighted area. I actually kind of expected to hear that as a negative, and we have not heard that. So, you could have something that's a technical success, but could be not successful overall. So it technically works, but the community doesn't accept it. And I think you'd hear those stories with doing something like this, that technically everything works, they're able to maintain it, but they hate the system. I think you'd get that through this. And vice versa. You could have a system that doesn't work, but when it does work, they love it. Yeah. Does that answer? Is that what you're looking for, I guess? Okay, so I think we're out of time.